at our last retreat, when we were talking about affordable housing, Councilmember Kelly had brought up, how do we measure success for affordable housing? And asked the question, are we the only one doing anything and carrying the load for others? And so what we did is we did a comparison. We did a survey of what other cities around us are doing and the amount of money that they're putting towards affordable housing. Obviously, some of them didn't answer that, so we have a small gathering of data, but it gives you a snapshot of kind of who the big movers and shakers are with regard to affordable housing in this area in particular. And then also, one of the things that you guys were wanting us to focus on this year was rehab of existing multifamily. And we had advised that is just a heavier lift, but we're going to talk about what we're doing in that space as well right now with regard to this RFP that we're about to put out, or NOFA we're about to put out, Notice of Funding Opportunity. And also, I know they're not going to talk about, I don't think y'all are talking about this, but just know from a rehab standpoint, just in the last week, we've been talking with Economic Development and with Alina's group on Stone Creek Apartments has come in wanting to do, that's an older complex that's in the Triangle that wants to do a LIHTC project where they would reinvest in the existing multifamily. That's exactly in line with what you guys were wanting to do. So we're working through those and what those numbers look like. We also have an extended stay hotel. We've been talking to the Suburban Inn that's over by Razoo's, and they have been, they're looking to sell their property. We're trying to get them to, with an affordable housing developer, potentially to turn that into, what are they, studio apartments. Potentially, we're really on the front end of that. We don't know if that'll actually happen. There's going to be a big gap in what that cost is going to be, but we're trying to figure out how to fill that gap. So letting you know we're doing things, but that's not really what we're talking about today. We're talking about more about the affordable housing comparison. So Alina, welcome.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. So we're going to get started with just a recap of data that we learned from our housing gap analysis and the toolkit, what has happened since then, and then that survey that Claire mentioned, and then what we have really succeeded in the last year, and then I'll hand it off to Grow America to talk more about the Rehab RFP. So this is a lot of info up here, but if you'll remember, we had a housing gap analysis a couple years back that analyzed our housing and what the gaps were in our community. And at the time, so on the left over there is homeowners, the right is renters, and then it starts at 50% AMI at the top, goes all the way down to 120% plus AMI. So you can see our two biggest gaps are renters and homeowners that are, I'm going to put that down so I don't wave it around a lot. Renters and homeowners that are under 50% AMI and then above 120% AMI, but our team really focuses more on the under 50% AMI. Quick reminder on under 50% AMI for a 4-person household is just over $55,000 annually. We do know that there's an article that's been shared a couple of times in our community. We kind of want to walk through it a little bit. So the Metro Texas Association of Realtors shared this article that they collected data from, I think it's called Go Banking or a similar entity, where they evaluated communities nationally that were followed these below markers. So populations between 25 and 200,000 folks had an increase in population from 2020 to 2022 of at least 9%. And then have an average home sales price of under $500,000 annually. City of Lewisville ranked, let me make sure, okay, 11th in the nation and second in Texas communities, because we did have a 16% increase from 2020 to 2022 of folks who are living here in the city of Lewisville, and then our average home price at that time was $410,000. This does help us with that gap that we talked about previously, because there is a gap for folks who are above 120% AMI. But just to take into account, this does take into account that Castle Hills annexation and how we had that big jump in that time period.
Can I ask a question about this real quick? Because every time I see average home, it makes me think differently, because it's so skewed by the Castle Hills product. You know, we looked at this before. I think last year we saw bands. Like the first 5 bands, they were just abutted up, and then Castle Hills was in the band all by itself. So I see 410 as the average. Median, I think, is probably a better way to do this to account for those skewing mechanisms on either side. Do we know what that number is?
So the number that we report is $371,349. This is reported from Go Banking.
Oh, I see. Okay.
The analysis that they did. Yeah, this is what they reported.
Okay.
But ours, I think Ashley talks through it in a different presentation, but it's 371,000.
Average or median? Okay, perfect. Thank you.
There you go. So this just provides some insight into local markets. Following that gap analysis that we completed, we did have the annexation, so that did bump our population up quite a bit, and then we stayed below that 500,000. Now we're going to get into survey cities. So I know lots of times there are questions about what are other cities doing? Are they doing as much or more than us, or not enough? So we did send out a survey to 17 different municipalities in our area. It included towns, cities, all sorts of communities. There are typical survey cities, so I can list them here a little bit. But we had 8 municipalities respond back to us. 4 out of those 8 did identify that affordable housing was a priority for them. And those 4 are Fort Worth, Denton, McKinney, and Plano. We did have a couple of cities or municipalities report back to us saying that it's not a priority for them right now. So Flower Mound, Capel, Carrollton, and Allen. A little bit further, deeper dive into the survey cities results. So when we sent off that survey, we asked them, is it a priority for you? What's your goals? What tools are you using? How much funding do you have allocated towards it? So this little left kind of chart over here is a bubble of different tools that the municipalities are using, and I'm going to use all these acronyms so that you can remember them all later. Let me get my slides so I don't mess any of them up. Okay. So PFC, Public Facility Corporation, Home Investment Partnerships Program. I know that doesn't make sense because it's not an acronym, but they do capitalize it like that. HOPWA, so Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS. CDC, Community Development Corporation. General Funds. LIHTC, so Low Income Housing Tax Credits. HFC, Housing Finance Corporation. Bonds. CDBG, Community Development Block Grant Funding, and then ESG, Emergency Solutions Grant Funding. I didn't even need to look at my paper. But you can see these are the tools that those cities reported they use for their affordable housing kind of projects. To the right over here is housing units that they reported are existing that are affordable, how many are under construction, and what is their goal. Any questions so far?
Yeah, thank you. I did want to point out also that I think you said 15 million of the 16 million of Denton's is from bond funding, that they had sold bonds for affordable housing. Also with Lewisville's funding, a good portion of that is coming from our CDBG, now home grants as well. So if those federal funds do go away, we would have to make a decision if whether or not we're going to be taking that same amount equivalent from our general fund or some other resource to put towards that. That's not something you need to discuss today, but it's just something that needs to be in the back of your mind that a large portion of our affordable housing efforts are spent using federal dollars.
Yeah, just around 1.2 million of our 1.4 million is, like Claire said, from our CDBG or our home funding that we receive. We became a home participating jurisdiction just this last year, so we're grateful that that number bumped up. For these housing units and goals reported, you can see that Fort Worth and Lewisville don't necessarily list a goal. We haven't necessarily identified a goal. We're just really focusing on generally more affordable housing. But Denton and McKinney do have kind of listed goals that they've communicated to us. You'll see Plano's not listed there. They do not calculate numbers in this way, so we don't have them included in this chart. And then some other municipalities that did receive our survey that we know that they do affordable housing or kind of prioritize affordable housing based on not only their strategic plans that are listed online, but their websites, any kind of vocal efforts that they communicate to the community. So that's Arlington, Dallas, Frisco, Grand Prairie, and Mesquite. And this one's going to have a lot of information. So there's 3 different categories that we really wanted to focus with y'all. So development, economic mobility, and then preservation. You can see we really focus heavily in the preservation space. But this graph kind of walks you through what are those strategies that we all agreed upon in our housing toolkit, what are some strategies or steps made that we've made from those strategies, and then kind of progress that we've had in the last year. So at the end of last year, we had our housing collaborative that launched in November. It is a collaborative of kind of local leaders in housing, banking, nonprofits, education, and a couple of other sectors that all get together and are stakeholders in housing. That collaborative started towards the end of last year, and then we'll have another meeting just coming up next week, actually. Since then, so these are our 3 kind of target areas, but development and strategy behind it was incentivizing construction of affordable units. Steps made towards that strategy was standard at Old Town with the PFC project. I'm going to get all these out so I can read it. And economic mobility, so increased homeowner knowledge and purchasing power. We don't necessarily have any funds tied to purchasing power right now or down payment assistance, but we do have our first-time homebuyer classes we launched last year. We're just about to be at a year of those classes. They happen every other month, and we've had about 85 folks show up in the last year to those homebuyer classes. We just had one here for City of Lewisville staff, so that was pretty exciting. Strategy around encouraging current Lewisville landlords and accepting vouchers. We're still working on what that looks like internally and how we can support that. So we'll get more info on that in the future. Strategy around funding local service providers to maintain housing. So we did become a home participating jurisdiction not too long ago, back in October. And that means that we now receive that formula grant. Each year we did get a larger sum this year than we will in the future, just because it was matched with TDHCA. So that funding will go to Denton Affordable Housing Corporation so that they can help us with some projects. And then preservation was a big piece right here. So programming that supports homeowners with financial burdensome repairs. So steps made towards that. We have our PEP program, our property enhancement program, PEP plus code abatement, and then I call it MERP, but I know most people in this room do not know what that means. It's minor housing rehab program, so our HVAC program. And those specific programs help folks remain housed so that they can continue to kind of thrive in Lewisville and not have burdensome repairs. Strategies supporting proposed LIHTC properties and proactive outreach. So we do have a couple of steps made in this direction. Our multifamily accessibility program, not sure if y'all can tell, but I came from a nonprofit background, so I like a lot of acronyms. So that multifamily accessibility program is specifically outreaching to LIHTC properties that are rolling off of their affordability window, and how we can support not only them increasing their accessibility, but remaining affordable. And then we also support LIHTC properties with resolutions of support or no objection. Strategy with seeking property for the PFC. This also is met with the standard at Old Town. And then our last one is conducting outreach to future programming for manufactured home communities. These 2 projects are fairly new in the last 6 to so months. So we had a Creekside pop-up event where we brought resources to Creekside Manufactured Home Community, and we're looking at doing that same event at a different community this year. And then we did dedicate some funds to manufactured home playground equipment, so really like livening up communal spaces in the manufactured home communities.
Melina, can you, I can't remember if we've taken it to council yet, that home funding going to DAHC. Can you remind them what DAHC is? Are we bringing that, have we already brought that to them?
We have not. So they're completing, so we have to certify them as a community housing development organization, or CHODO, in their process of sending us all of their information. A specific portion of our home funds have to go to a community housing development organization, or CHODO. It's required when you receive home funds, so they're getting that over to us. Once that side is done, we'll bring that agreement to council.
And can you talk about what kind of work they do?
Yeah, so they are kind of long-standing in the city of Denton. They have scattered site housing, so duplexes, single families. I think the largest property they currently have is either 6 or 8 units, but in total they have about 96 units in the city of Denton that they have purchased, rehabbed, and then they rent out to folks at an affordable rate. They are the property manager and the developer in that situation, and they've been around for over 2 decades in the city of Denton.
So, Council, I know one of the things you guys had wanted was us to focus on not just multifamily for affordability, and so this is a way for us to leverage those dollars for that.
And a sneak peek, they are looking at property close to Old Town, just looking now. So yeah, these are strategies, and then the steps made towards each of those strategies and what we've been busy with in the last year. Since we approved that toolkit and the housing gap analysis a couple years back. But I'm going to hand it off to Maureen to talk you through more of our preservation NOFA and how we've all worked together and what that looks like.
Sorry, before you go, real quick. So this is a great overview. I was looking for this exact kind of thing. So these are the things we do. These are categories. I appreciate that. On economic mobility, and this is, I don't know if you could quantify this inside of this little graphic here. When I think about that, I think about this is where council and staff can help lean in and make sure that we attract businesses that pay a rate that can allow people to afford the housing. So I didn't see that listed on here, but that's always an undercurrent of what we talk about when we talk about warehouse jobs and economic drivers coming into the city, right?
Yeah, I'm going to lean that to Mary Shell.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
I'll try. Let's see. So when I think about economic mobility, it's how do you get people out of programs to where they can self-serve. So that includes making sure that we attract businesses to the community that pay a rate that allow them to come out of these assistance programs and into a self-service program. So is that a specific thing that we talk about this, but I don't know if there's a specific project or program around that?
Not specifically, but when we're talking to our development partners about coming here to bring jobs and things of that nature, we try to focus on there being a salary component and having a level of different salary categories to ensure that their workers and hopefully new residents will also be able to afford the rents and afford their mortgage. Okay,
so that's worth calling out as well. I think it's part of the economic mobility efforts that we put into this sort of project.
Sure.
I think also something that we can tout, I mean, we're trying really hard to support, especially in Austin, the Texas State Technical College from that economic mobility standpoint. Yeah. But also we have several companies that have put training centers in Lewisville. Yeah. So I think those are also opportunities where people have an opportunity to, we got a tour of Erickson, and they hired, it was an amazing story, they hired Chipotle line workers. They hired one, that person was amazing, and they ended up hiring Chipotle's entire line staff, and now they're like running machines in Erickson. So great story. But I think that the training component, so you don't have to have that experience, is important as well. I'd
be remiss if I didn't call out the excellent programs that we have through LISD as well, phlebotomy and forklift driving, all kinds of things that you can do through the school system to help launch you into a well-paying job and career besides college-bound students.
Absolutely. And I'll also speak to a little bit about our Lewisville Housing Collaborative. So we have LISD social workers in that room, as well as folks who are working in kind of economic mobility spaces. We've had one meeting, it was last year, and we're having our next one next week, and it is focused on economic mobility and, what are we missing that we can also plug into or start listing out. Maybe we're already doing it, but we just didn't really click it in our brain to put it on the slide so that we can kind of support support not only efforts now, but also efforts that may be in the future as well. So that's part of our conversation with that Lewisville Housing Collaborative, to see kind of what they're wanting out of that as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, Maureen Milligan with Grow America. Great to be before you again. Today I'm going to walk you briefly through a little bit more about strategies regarding preservation and then the details of the proposed housing NOFA. So this is a page from your housing toolkit, and what we really tried to do was understand when we're talking about preserving housing, we're anticipating some housing that is currently affordable, so there's a restrictive covenant on a property, but those restrictive covenants that require it to offer affordable rents don't last forever. So it's really getting ahead of some of those risks of losing your existing housing stock, and then it's also recognizing that there's housing in Lewisville that's naturally occurring affordable housing, where because of its condition, because of its location, it's offering rents that are just lower than the market, but those properties are vulnerable to an investor coming in, putting some money into the property, and then raising rents, and then folks are displaced from the property. And so the housing NOFA that we'll talk about here could address more than one of these issues, but it'll address at least one issue, whether we have a tax credit property, existing property that comes in and applies for the funding, or whether we have a property that does not have a subsidy associated with it, but they're willing to accept city funding and then make at least half the property affordable. So we're not going to walk you through the whole draft NOFA. Certainly it will be available if you want to take a look at it, but I just wanted to highlight some of the key elements. So the properties that will be eligible, or let me just step back. There are three things that really guided the development of the NOFA. One was your city council priorities, and we heard loud and clear that you wanted us, from an apartment standpoint, from a multifamily standpoint, to focus on preservation. Two, it's aligning with the funding sources. You'll see on the next slide that there are three potential funding sources, all of which have different requirements, so we need to make sure that we're soliciting projects that will align with the funding requirements. And then it's also anticipating and aligning with the real estate market itself, so that we know we're only going to be one of the sources of funding for developers, and we don't want to make it any harder than it already is to put together the funding for a big rehab. So we want to be as aligned with other funding sources as possible. So one of the funding sources is CDBG, and so it requires, if you're going to put funding into a project, at least 51% of the units have to be reserved as affordable. So that's one thing that you'll see in the NOFA, is a project has to have at least 51% of the units are affordable. And certainly the best practice is you don't want all of it necessarily to be affordable. So this could be a project that comes in that has market rate tenants, as well as tenants that are receiving an affordable rent. And we want to make sure that the project is not affordable just short term for a couple of years. And again, this aligns with the funding source, a different funding source, home funding, where the funding will need to, the affordability will be at least 15 years. So as I mentioned, we wanted to make sure that we're aligned both with the housing toolkit's priorities as well as your other city plans, like your comprehensive plan, that are trying to strengthen neighborhoods and make them vibrant and accessible for families of different economic means. Since this is the first time you're putting out a NOFA like this, we do think it'll need to be on the street for a fair amount of time, because you're at those initial stages of developing relationships with developers. We've already obtained feedback from some developers, but we know that you really need to have the NOFA or the RFP on the street before they really dig into it and give feedback. So we want to make sure there's a chance to get feedback and to adjust if we need to. As was mentioned, we presented highlights of the NOFA to the Housing Collaborative and did receive feedback already. In general, what we heard was that they thought that the NOFA was aligned with what their priorities were, and they would potentially be interested in seeking funding. We think that the successful applicant will likely be someone who has already developed with tax credits or some other affordable housing program, because the money available is just not going to be enough to make a project work just in and of itself. So we think that the developers will be fairly experienced that will respond to this. There is a fair amount of risk. Since this is the first time you're putting this money out, we are going to get some kind of feedback from developers. We may need to adjust a little bit. And because some of this funding is federal funding, there are risks that there could be changes from the federal level, and economic changes. Do we have construction costs rise? Do we have other issues that make it more difficult to develop? So there are some risks, but we won't know until we put this on the street and see who comes and is interested. So you will only be eligible to apply for this funding if you are engaging in a substantial rehabilitation. So this is not lipstick on a pig. This is not just repainting an old apartment complex. You have to put a substantial amount of funding into the units and into any community space for you to be even eligible to obtain the funding. As I mentioned, at least half the units, or a little over half the units, have to be affordable for at least 15 years. And because these properties are already going to be occupied, we need to make sure that there is a well thought out relocation plan for what will happen to families when the substantial rehabilitation is occurring. The last thing you want to do is have a news article about how the city of Lewisville is funding a project that is displacing families from their units. So that will be something we've already anticipated, that they will need to have a very good relocation plan for those families that will be impacted during the rehabilitation. And this is just in case you wanted to see how exactly we're defining, for example, substantial rehabilitation and the amount of money that's required to be put in per unit. And then just a little more of a summary. As I mentioned, we have eligibility requirements, but then there will also be priorities. So if you are focusing on families that have lower incomes, that you will be prioritized over a project that says we want to focus on families that are at 80% of AMI. We also would prioritize projects that are investing in the resiliency and the energy efficiency of the property, because that reduces the property's operating costs in the long term. As I mentioned, there are multiple funding sources. So $350,000 from the Federal Home Program, $100,000 from the CDBG program, and then $300,000 from the General Fund. So we do anticipate that only one project, at most two, would be funded, and so they would be blending those funding sources. But there could be the potential that one project comes in and is only funded with one funding source, and so it could be structured a little bit differently. It'll be scored by city staff, and there will be a tiered application process. So we need to ensure that the developers have done their due diligence, but we understand that they can't have fully baked the project until they know they're getting the city funding. So they'll have to provide some information on rent rolls, on the project design, but then the diligence on the experience and the stability of the developer and the financial feasibility of the project will be evaluated after an initial decision has been made. These were the funding questions that we asked at the Housing Collaborative. And certainly if you have an interest in weighing in on any of these questions, but this is the point that if you have any questions or any comments for us on the NOFA design, would absolutely appreciate it.
Council. On the second bullet point, do you think affordable units should be limited to serving 60? I think based on the very first slide where we're talking about our gaps being at 60 and below, and the other one at being at 120 and above, I think this is appropriate. I don't think I want to move it up to 80% because I think we've got coverage in that space. I would love the minimum affordability period to be longer, but I don't know how you do that. It boggles my mind that we set up this type of a program or process and then it eventually pops back out. So it never solves the problem, at least not for the long term. So that's just a frustration, a systemic frustration I have with how we handle affordable housing in this country. So I'm not sure how to fix that. If I had that answer, I probably would be out on the speaking circuit. Yeah, absolutely. I don't want to be the guy displacing folks, so having the relocation plan.
I was just going to say, I agree that we definitely don't need the 80%. I don't think that's really scratching the surface of what our need really is. So I think 60%, I don't know if you could get a little bit lower than that, maybe 50%. I don't know if that's possible, but that would definitely be the priority. And I actually, the question about the substantial rehabilitation, I really love how I don't know how the city came up with, or who came up with the numbers that, so if it's less than 20 years old, it's 20,000 a unit, and if it's older, 30,000 a unit. I mean, I don't know how far that gets you, but that seems like a pretty significant number. And I definitely think that we have some existing stock here that could really, really use every penny of that, if not more.
And those numbers are taken from the state's qualified allocation plan, so it aligns with the tax credit application. And we chose that specifically so there was that level of alignment. And the benefit is the state does a lot of outreach with sophisticated affordable housing developers, and so those numbers are informed by the reality of the feedback they're getting from developers and from housing advocates too. They seek feedback from people both impacted and in need of affordable housing as well as developing affordable housing. I just wanted one clarification on your feedback. So right now, the priority, so there's eligibility and there's priority. So right now the NOFA is designed so that you could be eligible, your project could be eligible if you served up to 80% of AMI, but projects would get extra points if they're serving 60% AMI. We could make the eligibility at 60% AMI, and then targeting even lower as a priority, you get extra points. What we thought was, since they get extra points for 60% AMI, it still gives us the ability to select those projects, but it does, by allowing projects to propose 80% units, it just gives us a little more flexibility of who may come in the door and how they may structure their project. But we're at the point where we can adjust any of that right now, so I just wanted to make sure it was understood that right now 80% is eligible, 60% is prioritized.
And that's 60% and below.
Yes, 60% and below.
Okay. I mean, I'm on the fence on that because I think that we could have some developers come in with an 80%, but maybe what they're proposing is something that we could work with them to get that a little bit lower.
Right, because it could be maybe 10% at 80%. It might not be a large amount of percentage of the units that are 80%, but if we're able to, I guess the question is, are we okay with allowing some level, even if we don't even want 25%, maybe we want no more than 10% and 80% AMI, or if we would just want to leave it open?
I mean, I feel like we could potentially be missing out on an opportunity if we say that you're not eligible with 80%. My only concern with leaving it at the 80% is just, that's probably going to get a whole lot more applications with that criteria, and so it's just the staff time. But I don't. So that's on the negative side. On the positive side, we might end up with something much better.
There's nothing that obligates us to take any of them, right? So what I would say is, especially since this is the first time we've ever done this, I would cast our net wide and then see what we can get in, and then make the decision once we get that information, so we can consider all options.
Yeah, I can get on board with that.
What you said, like basically getting the NOFA out on the streets to see what the developers say, because I'm in school with a whole bunch of people who work for developers, and I specifically talked about rehabbing, and they were like, we'd rather scrape it, and because it's so expensive. So I'd be curious to get feedback from the developers that are interested and kind of get a real feel for what their costs actually are to help us kind of build this thing out and have something where we're getting good quality products.
We go back to the slide that shows what cities around us are participating, which ones aren't? Right here. So we have Carrollton, Capel, and Flower Mound. This isn't a priority for them. Allen is kind of a little bit away. Is there a way to make sure that we're taking care of our own citizens first? Some sort of residency requirement or something like that? What I don't want to do is go through and say, okay, we've got 5 units that we went through, and through the efforts of a lot of people, we have 5 units that are available. We have 5 units. We have 5 citizens of Lewisville who need those, but somebody else comes in from one of these cities who aren't making this a priority. They snap those up. Now we got to go find 5 more for our own residents. Is there a way to help make sure this is serving our Lewisville citizens first and foremost?
I think it would be easier if the subsidy was provided to the family. Here, since the subsidy is provided to the developer and it's rehab, you're really likely to be serving Lewisville residents anyways, because they're either in a tax credit property, their income qualifies, they're in need of affordability, and this is just going to extend the time that they can stay, or it's going to be a naturally occurring affordable housing. They're paying a lower rent, and this is just going to allow them to still stay in now a nicer property. So we don't expect that there will be a lot of displacement so that the units are being occupied by new people. It'll just be existing people that are in a safer, healthier unit, and they don't have to worry about their landlord raising the rent because it gets sold to a market rate developer.
Okay, thank you for that.
Can you go back to the housing gap analysis toolkit slide, way at the beginning?
Oh, way at the beginning, okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so what's driving my mindset here is that top right section. So that's our under 50% AMI. I've got a gap, meaning I'm short almost 4,600 units. That's what I want to drive. So if throwing in a couple of 80% helps, that's great. But I'm looking at the 80% AMI, and I've got a surplus of 7,000 units. So, if it can help me get more in the deficit column, okay. But I don't want to fatten up. See where that's what's driving my mindset on the conversation. So let's make sure whatever we're doing is targeting where we have the deficit gap. And I think most of us are looking at because I'm not hearing any conversation around it, is we're going, well, if you're 120% AMI, you're doing okay. We don't think we necessarily, while there is a market gap, we don't necessarily want to bend the market to fix that particular gap. That's not what I'm hearing from council at this point. But if I'm going to spend money in this space, I want to fill that market gap of 4,600 units. So whatever helps.
The benefit of allowing that 80% is there was a change in the tax credit program a couple of years ago that allowed for what's called income averaging. So housing tax credits used to have to focus on 60 or 50% AMI exclusively. Now they can average the incomes of people, but it still has to average back to the 60 or the 50. So if you have 80% units, what that means then is you also then do have like 30% AMI units. So it allows for that deeper affordability targeting.
And I think it also goes back to the ultimate cost for the developer, for the owner, right? And I think a way that we can combat that is, in addition to these funds, it will likely include the PFC as well, just to help offset that. And we have ways that we can negotiate what our revenue is going to be from the PFC to help basically put the money back into it, take less than we would otherwise have received to make it more affordable and go into those deeper levels.
Okay, so at least we have some options. So good. All right. Thank you. Are there any other questions or feedback? I think we're at the end of this part of the story. So awesome. Thank you, team. Great overview.